Member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague for his speech. Mr. Speaker, my colleague talked about harnessing the experience of people directly impacted, and that's not in this bill. And I absolutely agree. The Act creates Indigenous engagement committees for port authorities. And when I talk to New Chalmouth people in my riding, that's not good enough. They actually want a seat at the table, an appointment for all of the nations, each nation whose territory that port authorities reside on, the waterways and lands on whose territories they are on. And it's identified in the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action number 92, where it's explicit. It cites that they call upon the corporate sector in Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a reconciliation framework and to apply its principles, norms, and standards to corporate policy and core operational activities involving Indigenous peoples and their lands and resources. Does my colleague not agree that Indigenous peoples shouldn't just be sitting as an advisory committee, but they actually deserve a permanent seat at the table for every port authority whose lands and waterways that they reside on?
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I appreciate the question from my colleague, and I look forward to working with him on the Government Operations Committee with the revisions that have been made to committee membership. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to Indigenous engagement, I do think it's important for that engagement to happen and for it to be driven by the particulars of the circumstances in terms of where the port is. Just because of location and where Indigenous nations are, it seems to me that there would likely be significant variation in terms of the approach that's taken depending on where those ports are and again, what nations are proximate, how many, and so forth. So I think the member's proposal is an interesting one, but I do think any kind of mandating of structure from us here in Ottawa should be done very carefully, if at all. And a better approach would be, again, to recognize the need for local boards to make evaluations and determinations around how this proceeds. I will say as well, though, to his point about Indigenous representation on the board, it's a power of the minister to make these appointments, right? The minister currently, without this legislation, has the power to determine who sits on the board. So the minister could appoint members of those nations. But I suppose what he's suggesting is not so much that. It's that maybe he's suggesting that the nations themselves would be able to make these appointments. So I guess I'd welcome him to further kind of elucidate what that structure could look like, and I'm sure he will make these points if the bill gets to committee.